So hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson and I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. And in this video I'm going to be covering Sam Vaknin. And this is part of my course that I'm offering for free online that covers Scapegoat recovery and narcissistic abuse recovery. And so I was actually fortunate enough to interview Sam Vaknin. And so he's a clinical psychologist and a professor that very much specializes in narcissistic abuse. And he's said to have coined a lot of the terms in terms of narcissistic abuse, of narcissistic defenses, and different aspects of the personality disorder, and particularly how it impacts the target or the victim. So stay tuned as I cover Sam Vaknin and cover his approach in terms of narcissistic abuse. All right, so in this module, I'm going to cover Sam Vaknin's work. We're focusing on the interior, the upper left of the quadrants. And Sam Vaknin's work is different in the sense that he's focused on narcissism. He's a clinical psychologist himself, and he indicates that he's a narcissist himself. And in his book, Narcissism Revisited, he explains that it's the first book on narcissism abuse. I watched his videos, and anyone who went down the rabbit hole has probably seen a lot of his videos online. When it comes to expertise in this area, he very much hones in on the core aspects of narcissism and gives you a really good lens on how to think about it. On my journey, he was definitely helpful in understanding the narcissist from what's going on in terms of their inner psyche. He has different ways of defining the narcissist. One of the core ideas of his theory is the notion of the narcissist having a false self. A lot of literature is out there in terms of why people become narcissists. His perspective is that the narcissist has developed a false self from a young age due to neglect or emotional abuse. There are some theories that this could be hardwired, involving both nurture and nature. If we assume that for whatever reason the narcissist develops a false self, what is the false self? The false self is the notion the narcissist created to protect true self. His notion is that we all have a true self, but from a young age, narcissists develop this false self. The narcissist's whole engagement, particularly with the notion of narcissistic supply, is based on this false self. What feeds the false self is narcissistic supply, external validation to confirm its identity. People with parents who have this sense of false self come to understand from a very young age that you don't cross this concept of the false self, and if you do, there's going to be trouble. It shows up in different dynamics within a family. Core, if you understand the notion of the false self, you can understand a lot of what it means to grow up in this environment and to be on the receiving end of this form of abuse. Sam Vaknin describes the false self as a grandiose, idolized, developed in response to childhood trauma or neglect, shielding the child from being damaged or inadequate, essentially the true self. False self becomes the narcissist's primary identity, requires constant affirmations, having narcissistic supply to sustain its illusion of superiority. Internally, the narcissist is trapped in the cycle of projecting and facade while suppressing deep-seated shame and emptiness. So that's pretty deep. That false self requires narcissistic supply, is created to protect the true self, built on the illusion of superiority. So in the DSM, there are cluster B personality disorders. Narcissistic disorder, which we'll get into using Sam Vaknin's work, is one of the cluster B personality disorders. One of the core aspects of a narcissist is the need to be better than. In relationships, they constantly have to be superior to the other, creating this dynamic in all their interactions. In this program, we're focusing more on the parent-child relationship primarily, but that is just core to this personality disorder. If someone has full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, understanding of personality disorder is the notion that there is a lack of insight or willingness to really understand at a very core level who they are. It's very much global in their perspective, having a personality disorder, and it shapes the entire worldview and perspective of that individual. Narcissistic supply is the fuel of the false self, and it encompasses attention, praise, control, and can even be negative reactions. Any form of attention on the narcissist is narcissistic supply, and as long as it reinforces the significance of the narcissist. This is what's important for the narcissist. And so this is why you can see narcissists, even when you stand up to them or try to keep them accountable, they almost enjoy sometimes those reactions or that attention. You see this in young children, right? A child acting out, a child stuck in their ego, very much going to be reactive in the same way. You either get negative attention or positive attention. At some point, once it's not getting positive attention, the child will go to negative attention. It really doesn't differ with these individuals, which is very concerning and sickening in some sense that they require this. Unfortunately, that's the situation with these individuals. He talks about narcissist supply being an intense hunger for attention, and it's very much consumed by this need for supply. It drives the manipulation and exploitative behavior of the narcissist because it's almost like an addict, right? Relationships become transactional for these individuals. It's about confirming and affirming their false self. As children, you grow up knowing that if you offend your parent, or we'll get into this, but the notion of narcissistic injury, then usually there can be consequences to pay. Another aspect of Vaknin's definition of narcissism is the lack of empathy. This is core to their personality. They lack genuine empathy, a trait rooted in their emotional shallowness. Things are very superficial for these individuals. While they might intellectually understand emotions and what a person is going through, they don't have the capacity to fully internalize empathy. They have what Vaknin calls cold empathy. At a core level, they're lacking that. Sometimes people say for these individuals, something in their brain is wired differently. And so if you understand that, that's another core aspect to these types of people. Vaknin talks about how this leads to all relationships for the narcissist to be transactional. And so it's really not about you, it's about them and them getting narcissistic supply. And so everyone is really just an extension of them. And he talks about playthings. So to them, especially their children, it's asserting an extension of themselves, right? And so that comes back to boundaries, and this enmeshment is that for these individuals, especially their kids, it's just an extension of them, and they tend to project, and there's a notion of splitting as well on their children in terms of roles, which we'll get into in later sections. And another core aspect to narcissism, according to Vaknin, is the defense mechanisms. If you're on the receiving end of these individuals, you understand how difficult it is to communicate with them and to get any sense of reality or common understanding. And this comes down to false self and the defense mechanisms that come up to defend the false self, especially any acknowledgement, any kind of weakness or faults, because it's so fragile. It's based on an unsustainable foundation. It's very fragile, weak, and vulnerable, the defense mechanisms. Some of the main core ones are projections, blaming others for their flaws, denial, and gaslighting. Denial is pretty self-evident. You deny and shift blame onto others. Understanding the defense mechanisms, projection, denial, and gaslighting. Gaslighting is distorting others' realities. These mechanisms maintain the grandiose illusion of the false self, preventing the narcissist from confronting their vulnerabilities or taking accountability. The final aspect is understanding the different forms of narcissism. So I mentioned earlier narcissistic personality disorder. Within that, there are usually core distinctions between the grandiose, overt narcissist, marked by overt arrogance, and the vulnerable or covert narcissist, characterized by hidden entitlement beneath a shy, vindictive, or victimized exterior. He also discussed malignant narcissism, involving dark triad individuals with psychopathic or antisocial tendencies, and a severe form of blending narcissistic personality with antisocial traits. But despite these variations, all share the core internal dynamic of the false self and the need for narcissistic supply. So I went through Vaknin's basic definition of the narcissist, and next I'm going to explore what it means to be on the receiving end for people, especially if they grew up in a family of origin with either one or both parents having narcissistic qualities or full-blown personality disorder. We talked about emotional maturity as one core component of understanding these types of individuals. But if we also use the lens of Sam Vaknin's, we can understand the notion of the false self, the defense mechanisms, and the different forms of narcissism: overt, covert, and malignant narcissism. And I'll also link a video from Dr. Phil. He does a really good job of walking through the different forms of narcissism. He provides a very helpful high-level overview of the different forms of narcissism, so I'll link that in the description. And in future modules, I'll be discussing other thinkers in this area. Basically, we walk through some perspective in terms of narcissistic supply and the false self, and you can start to understand why these individuals are so difficult to deal with and manage. In the next module, I'm going to go through the perspective of being on the receiving end of that narcissistic abuse and what it means for you, and likely some of the behaviors and the inner childhood trauma that occurred due to being part of this environment growing up. In Sam Vaknin's work, he talks about the narcissistic abuse cycle. He walks through a dynamic that occurs often. He talks about idealization, devaluation, and discard. Some people introduce love bombing as part of the stage. If we understand the narcissist having a false self and needing narcissistic supply, and relationships being transactional, you can understand it from these three phases. When a narcissist meets a person for the first time, they will look for narcissistic supply, such as status or something they want mirrored. According to Sam Vaknin's work, he doesn't think victims have anything particular or unique about them.